Good evening, all, and welcome back to Verified Whispers. Deep in the heart of Appalachia, where ancient mountains hold secrets older than human memory, 10 souls have walked paths they wish they could forget. Tonight, we journey into the shadowed hollows, where cell phone towers fear to reach, and where the mist carries whispers of things that should have stayed buried. From the coal-stained valleys of West Virginia to the fog-shrouded peaks of North Carolina, these encounters will challenge everything you thought you knew about what lurks in America's oldest wilderness. These aren't campfire tales passed down through generations. These are testimonies from people who ventured too deep into places where the boundary between our world and something far more sinister grows dangerously thin. Tonight, you'll hear from a park ranger who discovered footprints that led to nowhere, a geologist who found caves that weren't on any map, and a family whose ancestral land holds a curse that spans 4 generations. Each story comes from the deepest, most isolated corners of Appalachia, where the mountains themselves seem to watch and remember. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Verified Whispers for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Story 1. The Ranger's Last Report. Marcus Henley had been a park ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest for 17 years when he filed what would become his final incident report. It was October 2019, and Marcus was conducting routine trail maintenance deep in the Red River Gorge when he discovered something that would shatter his understanding of the wilderness he thought he knew so well. The morning started like any other, with Marcus hiking the unmarked service trail that led to the most remote section of the gorge, a place where tourists never ventured and where even experienced hikers rarely dared to explore. As he made his way through the dense canopy of ancient hemlocks, Marcus noticed the forest had fallen unnaturally silent. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, not even the distant sound of wind through the trees. The only sound was his own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. After 23 years of working in these mountains, Marcus knew that such complete silence usually meant one thing: a predator was nearby. But as he scanned the forest around him, he saw nothing unusual. It wasn't until he reached the old logging road, abandoned since the 1940s, that Marcus discovered the first set of tracks. They were human footprints, but unlike any he had ever seen. The prints were massive, easily size 18 or larger. But what disturbed Marcus most was their depth. These weren't the impressions of someone walking casually through the forest. The heel strikes were so deep they had compressed the forest floor down to the clay layer beneath, suggesting someone carrying an enormous amount of weight or someone incredibly heavy themselves. Marcus followed the trail of prints for nearly half a mile, documenting each one with his camera as part of standard protocol. The stride length was impossibly long, nearly 4 feet between steps, and the prints showed no signs of a normal walking gait. Instead, they appeared to be the result of someone taking massive, deliberate leaps across the forest floor. As he followed the trail deeper into the wilderness, Marcus began to notice other disturbing details. Tree branches 12 feet off the ground had been snapped clean through, hanging at odd angles as if something large had pushed through them with tremendous force. The trail led Marcus to a clearing he had never seen before, despite having mapped this section of the forest numerous times over the years. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of ancient oak trees, their trunks twisted into unnatural spirals that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The ground within the circle was completely barren, not even weeds or moss growing in the rich mountain soil. But it was what Marcus found at the base of the largest oak that made his blood run cold. Scattered around the tree's massive root system were dozens of personal belongings: hiking boots, backpacks, water bottles, and camping gear. All of it appeared to have been there for years, weathered by countless seasons, but arranged in a deliberate pattern that suggested human intelligence behind their placement. Marcus recognized some of the gear from missing person reports he had filed over the years. There was Jennifer Walsh's distinctive red backpack from 2016, the hiking boots that belonged to the college student who had vanished in 2018, and a water bottle with a name etched into it that Marcus remembered from a search and rescue operation that had lasted 2 weeks but turned up nothing. As Marcus began photographing the evidence, he became aware of a sound that made his skin crawl. It started as a low humming, almost like the drone of insects, but gradually grew louder and more complex. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath the ground, vibrating up through his boots and into his bones. As the humming intensified, Marcus noticed that the twisted oak trees were beginning to sway despite the complete absence of wind. Their spiral trunks seemed to be rotating slowly, like massive screws turning in the earth. That's when Marcus saw him. Standing at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows of the normal trees, was a figure that defied explanation. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with impossibly long limbs that hung at odd angles from its massive frame. Its skin appeared to be a mottled gray-green, like bark that had been diseased and left to rot. But it was the creature's eyes that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his days. They were completely white, with no pupils or iris visible, yet Marcus could feel them boring into his soul with an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. The creature didn't move toward Marcus, but instead began to emit a sound that was part whistle, part scream, and part something else entirely that human language couldn't describe. The sound seemed to resonate with the humming coming from beneath the ground, creating a harmony that made Marcus's teeth ache and his vision blur. As the sounds intensified, the personal belongings around the oak tree began to shift and rearrange themselves, forming new patterns that hurt to look at directly. Marcus's training kicked in, and he began backing slowly toward the tree line, never taking his eyes off the creature. But as he moved, he realized that the forest around him had changed. The trail he had followed into the clearing was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of thorny undergrowth that hadn't been there moments before. The twisted oak trees were spinning faster now, their roots emerging from the ground like massive tentacles that writhed and reached toward him. In desperation, Marcus turned and ran toward what appeared to be an opening in the vegetation, crashing through branches and thorns that tore at his uniform and skin. Behind him, the creature's otherworldly cry grew louder, joined by what sounded like dozens of other voices coming from the ground itself. Marcus ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at his face and roots trying to trip him with every step. When Marcus finally burst onto the familiar logging road, he was bleeding from dozens of cuts and his uniform was in tatters. He looked back toward the clearing, but saw only normal forest. The twisted oak trees were gone, replaced by the same hemlocks and maples that had always grown in that area. Even more disturbing, when Marcus checked his camera, all the photos he had taken of the footprints and the personal belongings showed only empty forest floor and normal tree trunks. Marcus filed his report that evening, documenting every detail he could remember despite the lack of photographic evidence. 3 days later, he submitted his resignation and moved his family to Florida, refusing to explain his decision to anyone. The official report was buried in Forest Service archives, but hikers in that area of the Daniel Boone National Forest continue to report strange sounds coming from beneath the ground and the occasional sighting of impossibly large footprints that seem to appear and disappear without explanation. The Forest Service has never acknowledged Marcus Henley's final report, but they have quietly restricted access to that section of the Red River Gorge, claiming environmental concerns. Local rangers now patrol in pairs and are instructed to avoid the old logging roads after sunset. And sometimes, on nights when the fog rolls thick through the hollows, they say you can still hear that otherworldly humming rising from deep within the earth, calling to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to venture too far into the heart of Appalachian darkness. Story 2. The Cartographer's Discovery. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent her entire career mapping the unmappable corners of America. But nothing in her 22 years as a geological surveyor had prepared her for what she would discover in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky in the summer of 2021. Elena had been contracted by the state to update geological surveys of the area following several minor earthquakes that had shifted underground water tables and potentially created new cave systems. What should have been a routine 3-week mapping expedition would become the most terrifying experience of her life. One that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about the ancient Appalachian Mountains. Elena's team consisted of herself, graduate student Tommy Chen, and veteran cave explorer Maria Santos, a local woman whose family had lived in these mountains for 6 generations. They were investigating reports from local residents about strange sounds coming from underground and the appearance of new sinkholes that seemed to have opened overnight. The area they were surveying was part of a massive limestone cave system that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the Cumberland Plateau. But this particular section had never been properly mapped due to its remote location and the dangerous terrain above ground. On their 4th day in the field, Elena's ground-penetrating radar detected an enormous void, roughly 300 feet beneath their campsite. The cavity appeared to be a natural chamber, but its perfectly circular shape and unusual depth readings suggested something far more complex than a typical limestone cave. When Elena cross-referenced her readings with historical geological surveys dating back to the 1890s, she discovered that no previous expedition had ever detected anything in this location. It was as if the chamber had simply materialized in the past few decades. Maria Santos had grown increasingly uncomfortable as they approached the area where Elena's equipment indicated a surface entrance to the underground chamber. She kept muttering in a mixture of English and what Elena later learned was an archaic form of Cherokee that her great-grandmother had taught her. When Elena asked about her concerns, Maria explained that her family had always avoided this particular hollow, passing down stories about people who had entered the area and returned fundamentally changed. Some came back speaking in voices that weren't their own. Others developed an obsessive need to dig into the earth with their bare hands until their fingers were bloody stumps. And some never came back at all. Despite Maria's warnings, Elena was determined to investigate the chamber. Using Tommy's drone equipped with infrared cameras, they located what appeared to be a natural entrance hidden beneath a tangle of rhododendron bushes and fallen trees. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. But Elena's equipment, readings suggested it connected to the massive void system below. As they cleared away the vegetation, they discovered that the entrance was surrounded by dozens of small holes in the ground, each about the size of a silver dollar and perfectly round. The holes appeared to be recently made, with fresh soil scattered around their edges. Elena was the first to enter the cave system, rappelling down a narrow shaft that opened into a corridor unlike anything she had ever encountered. The walls were composed of limestone, but they had been carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed through her headlamp. The patterns weren't random natural formations, but appeared to be some form of writing or symbolic language that covered every inch of the cave walls from floor to ceiling. More disturbing was the fact that the carvings appeared to be fresh, with sharp edges that hadn't been worn smooth by thousands of years of water erosion. As Elena made her way deeper into the cave system, following a passage that sloped steadily downward, she began to notice that her equipment was behaving strangely. Her compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, and her GPS unit showed her location as coordinates that placed her several hundred miles away in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The temperature readings from her instruments fluctuated wildly, sometimes showing the cave temperature as a comfortable 68 degrees. Other times registering temperatures well below freezing or impossibly hot readings that should have been lethal to human life. The passage eventually opened into the massive chamber Elena had detected from the surface. But what she found there defied every principle of geology and physics she had learned in her decades of scientific training. The chamber was indeed circular and enormous, easily the size of a football stadium. But its walls curved upward and inward in a way that created an impossible optical illusion. When Elena looked up toward what should have been the chamber's ceiling, she saw not rock formations, but what appeared to be a vast, starry sky, complete with constellations she didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that hurt her eyes to look at directly. The floor of the chamber was covered in a fine, black sand that felt warm beneath Elena's boots, despite the cool cave air. As she walked across the sandy surface, her footsteps created small sparks of pale blue light that lingered for several seconds before fading away. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made Elena's scientific mind struggle to maintain its grip on rational thought. Rising from the sand was a structure that could only be described as a building, though it followed no architectural principles known to human civilization. The structure appeared to be carved from a single piece of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface was covered in the same intricate patterns Elena had seen on the cave walls. But here they seemed to move and shift constantly, creating new configurations that made her dizzy to observe. The building had no discernible doors or windows, but Elena could see that sections of its walls occasionally became transparent, revealing glimpses of vast spaces within that seemed to extend far beyond what the structure's external dimensions could possibly contain. As Elena circled the impossible building, documenting everything with her camera, she became aware of a sound that seemed to come from within the structure itself. It was a rhythmic tapping, like Morse code, but far more complex and following patterns that suggested an intelligence trying to communicate. Elena realized that the tapping was responding to her movements, changing tempo and rhythm as she walked around the building. When she stopped moving, the tapping stopped. When she moved faster, the tapping accelerated. Elena's scientific training compelled her to investigate further, but every instinct she possessed screamed at her to flee. As she approached one of the sections of wall that periodically became transparent, she could see movement within the structure. Shadows that didn't correspond to any light source moved through the interior spaces, and occasionally she caught glimpses of what appeared to be machinery of some kind, though its purpose and operation were completely alien to anything she had ever encountered. The tapping sound suddenly stopped, replaced by a low vibration that Elena could feel in her bones. The black sand beneath her feet began to shift and swirl, creating patterns that matched the carvings on the walls and the building's surface. Elena's equipment began emitting warning alarms as radiation levels spiked far beyond safe parameters. But the readings made no sense because they showed types of radiation that didn't exist according to known physics. That's when Elena saw them. Emerging from the transparent sections of the building's walls were figures that might once have been human, but had been changed into something else entirely. They moved with a strange, jerky motion that reminded Elena of marionettes being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Their skin had the same gray-green pallor she had heard described in Maria's family stories, and their eyes had been replaced by the same perfectly round holes she had found surrounding the cave entrance. The figures began walking toward Elena with that same unnatural gait, and as they moved, The tapping sound resumed. But now it was coming from their footsteps on the sand. Elena realized with growing horror that the tapping wasn't random. It was spelling out her name in Morse code over and over again. Somehow, these things knew who she was, and they had been waiting for her arrival. Elena turned and ran for the passage that led back to the surface. But the cave system had changed during her time in the chamber. Corridors that had been straight now curved in impossible directions, and passages that had sloped upward now led deeper underground. Her headlamp illuminated walls covered with fresh carvings that seemed to chronicle her descent into the cave system, showing images of herself at various stages of her journey, rendered in disturbing detail by whatever intelligence inhabited this place. After what felt like hours of running through a maze of passages that defied three-dimensional geometry, Elena finally found herself back at the original entrance shaft. She could see daylight far above, and the familiar voices of Tommy and Maria calling her name. But as she began climbing toward the surface, Elena realized that the sounds coming from above weren't quite right. Tommy's voice had a strange echo to it, and Maria was speaking in that archaic Cherokee dialect. But the words she was using made Elena's skin crawl because they were the same sounds she had heard the transformed figures making in the chamber below. When Elena finally emerged from the cave, she found Tommy and Maria waiting for her. But something fundamental had changed. They looked the same, moved the same, even spoke with their familiar voices. But Elena could see in their eyes the same empty darkness she had witnessed in the figures within the impossible building. They helped her pack up the equipment with mechanical efficiency, never asking about what she had discovered or why she had been underground for over 18 hours instead of the 2-hour survey she had planned. Elena left the mountains that night, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of equipment and never filing an official report about her discoveries. She resigned from the university 3 weeks later and moved to Arizona, as far from limestone cave systems as she could manage. But the nightmares followed her. Dreams of tapping sounds that spelled out the names of everyone she had ever loved, and visions of impossible buildings rising from black sand beneath starless skies. Local residents report that the area where Elena conducted her survey has been permanently altered. The forest in that hollow has died, replaced by strange vegetation that grows in perfect geometric patterns. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark, hikers report hearing the sound of tapping coming from deep underground, a complex rhythm that seems to be calling out names in a code that predates human language. The State Geological Survey has declared the area off-limits due to unstable ground conditions. But the real reason remains buried in classified files that will never see the light of day. Story 3. The mining town's final secret. Rebecca Ashworth thought she was getting the deal of a lifetime when she purchased 40 acres of abandoned mining land in the mountains of West Virginia for less than the price of a used car. As a documentary filmmaker specializing in Appalachian history, Rebecca planned to use the property as a base camp while researching the forgotten coal mining communities that had once thrived in these remote hollows. The land came with the remnants of a company town called Black Rock Falls, which had been abandoned in 1952 after what official records described as an industrial accident that claimed the lives of 37 miners. What those records didn't mention was why the entire town of nearly 400 residents had vanished within a single week, leaving behind homes with meals still on tables and children's toys scattered in empty playgrounds. Rebecca arrived at Black Rock Falls in September 2020, driving her RV up a deteriorating mountain road that hadn't seen regular maintenance in decades. The town sat in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges that blocked most sunlight even during midday, creating a perpetual twilight that gave the abandoned buildings an otherworldly appearance. The company houses were still standing, their paint long since weathered away, but their structures remarkably intact after nearly 70 years of abandonment. Most unsettling were the personal belongings that remained scattered throughout the town. Photographs on mantelpieces, children's clothing in closets, and calendars on kitchen walls still turned to October 1952. As Rebecca explored the ghost town with her camera equipment, documenting the preserved remnants of mid-20th century life, she began to notice details that contradicted the official story of a gradual evacuation following an industrial accident. The evidence suggested that the residents of Black Rock Falls had left in tremendous haste, abandoning valuable possessions and family heirlooms that no family would willingly leave behind. In the town's general store, the cash register was still full of money, and the shelves were stocked with goods that had somehow remained remarkably preserved despite decades of exposure to the elements. Rebecca's first night in Black Rock Falls was disturbed by sounds she initially attributed to settling timber in the old buildings and wildlife moving through the abandoned structures. But as she lay in her RV, parked near the town's central square, she became aware of a rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from beneath the ground. It was a steady, mechanical pounding that reminded her of mining equipment. But the mine shaft had been sealed with concrete decades ago, according to the county records she had researched. The next morning, Rebecca decided to investigate the sealed mine entrance, which was located about half a mile up the mountainside behind the town. What she found disturbed her more than the abandoned buildings. The concrete seal that was supposed to block the mine entrance had been broken from the inside, with chunks of reinforced concrete scattered across the ground, as if something with enormous strength had punched through the barrier. The opening revealed a shaft that descended into absolute darkness, and the mechanical pounding sound was definitely emanating from somewhere deep within the mountain. Rebecca's documentary instincts overcame her growing sense of unease, and she descended into the mine shaft using climbing equipment she had brought for filming in difficult locations. The main tunnel was larger than she expected, wide enough for mining equipment to pass through, and the walls showed evidence of recent activity, despite the mine's official closure in 1952. Fresh tool marks scored the limestone walls, and the wooden support beams appeared to have been recently replaced with newer timber that hadn't had time to weather and age like the rest of the mine infrastructure. As Rebecca made her way deeper into the mine, following the sound of the mechanical pounding, she discovered that the tunnel system was far more extensive than any of the official mining company records had indicated. Passages branched off in multiple directions, and many of them showed signs of recent excavation work. More disturbing were the working areas she found along the main tunnel, spaces that had been carved out of the rock and equipped with modern lighting systems powered by generators that hummed quietly in the darkness. The mechanical pounding led Rebecca to a vast underground chamber that defied everything she knew about mining operations in 1950s Appalachia. The space was enormous, easily the size of an airplane hangar, and it was filled with machinery that looked like nothing she had ever seen before. The devices appeared to be some hybrid of mining equipment and scientific instruments, with complex arrays of sensors and monitoring devices that displayed readouts in languages she didn't recognize. But most unsettling was the fact that the machinery was operating without any human supervision, following automated routines that had apparently been running continuously for decades. At the far end of the chamber, Rebecca discovered what the machinery was working on. The miners of Black Rock Falls hadn't been extracting coal from the mountain. They had been digging towards something that was already buried deep within the limestone substrate. The excavation had exposed a structure that was clearly not of human origin, something that had been entombed within the mountain for an incomprehensible length of time. The structure's surface was covered in the same type of intricate carvings Rebecca had read about in accounts of other mysterious discoveries throughout Appalachia. Symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. As Rebecca documented the impossible scene with her camera, she began to understand the true horror of what had happened to the residents of Black Rock Falls. They hadn't been evacuated after an industrial accident. They had been recruited for a different kind of work entirely. The mining operation had been a cover story for an excavation project that had awakened something that should have remained buried. The mechanical pounding she had been hearing wasn't mining equipment at all, but something within the ancient structure trying to break free after decades of containment. Rebecca's camera began malfunctioning as she approached the structure, the digital display showing images that weren't there and recording sounds at frequencies that shouldn't have been audible to human ears. Through the camera's viewfinder, she could see movement within the structure. Shadows that moved with purpose and intelligence through spaces that appeared to exist in more than 3 dimensions. The carvings on the structure's surface weren't just decorative. They were instructions, written in a language that predated human civilization and describing processes that human minds weren't equipped to comprehend. The mechanical pounding suddenly intensified, joined by other sounds coming from within the structure that made Rebecca's teeth ache and her vision blur. The machinery in the chamber began operating at increased speed, and displays that had been showing steady readings now flashed warnings in that unknown language. Rebecca realized that her presence had triggered some kind of response from whatever was contained within the ancient structure, and the carefully maintained equilibrium that had kept it dormant for 7 decades was beginning to fail. As Rebecca turned to flee the chamber, she encountered figures moving through the tunnel system with the same mechanical precision she had observed in the automated machinery. They wore the clothing and hard hats of 1950s coal miners, but their movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Their eyes had been replaced by the same type of sensors that adorned the machinery in the chamber, and when they spoke, their voices carried the same electronic harmonics that emanated from the ancient structure. Rebecca ran through the tunnel system as the miners pursued her with their unnatural gait, their voices calling out her name in tones that suggested they had been expecting her arrival. The passages seemed to shift and change as she ran, tunnels that had led upward now sloping deeper into the mountain, and emergency exits that should have led to the surface, instead opening into vast spaces filled with more of the impossible machinery. When Rebecca finally reached the surface, emerging from the mine shaft as dawn broke over the abandoned town, she found that Black Rock Falls had changed during her night underground. The buildings were no longer empty. Lights flickered in windows that should have been dark, and she could see figures moving through the streets with that same mechanical precision she had witnessed in the miners below ground. The residents of Black Rock Falls had returned, but they weren't quite human anymore. Rebecca fled in her RV, abandoning her equipment and research materials in her desperate escape from the valley. She never completed her documentary about Appalachian mining communities, and she never spoke publicly about what she had discovered beneath Black Rock Falls. But local residents report that the ghost town is no longer abandoned. On clear nights, they can see lights moving through the streets of the valley, and the sound of machinery echoes from deep within the mountain as whatever was awakened there continues its patient work. The county has quietly rezoned the area as environmentally protected land, preventing any future development or exploration. But hikers who venture too close to the valley report hearing voices calling their names from the darkness between the trees. Voices that carry the same electronic harmonics that Rebecca recorded in the depths beneath Black Rock Falls, where something ancient and patient waits for the next curious soul to help it complete its emergence into our world. Story 4. The Inheritance of Hollow Creek. When Nathaniel Briggs inherited his great-uncle's property in the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee, he thought he was finally catching a break after years of financial struggles. The inheritance included a modest farmhouse, 47 acres of forested land, and what the legal documents described as various outbuildings and historical structures of indeterminate age. What the documents failed to mention was why his great-uncle Ezra had lived as a complete recluse for the final 30 years of his life, or why the local postal service had stopped delivering mail to the property in 1987. After 3 different mail carriers reported incidents they refused to describe in detail. Nathaniel arrived at the property in late October 2022, driving up a gravel road that wound through dense forest for nearly 3 miles before reaching the farmhouse. The building sat in a natural clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, whose branches formed an almost perfect circle around the structure, creating a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, the house existed in perpetual shadow. The farmhouse itself was in remarkably good condition, considering it had been vacant for over 2 years since Ezra's death. With fresh paint on the shutters and a roof that showed no signs of weather damage despite the harsh mountain winters. As Nathaniel explored the interior of the house, he discovered that his great-uncle had been an obsessive record keeper, maintaining detailed journals that documented daily life on the property going back to 1962. The early entries described typical rural activities, farming, hunting, maintenance projects. But as the years progressed, the entries became increasingly focused on what Ezra referred to as the management protocols and containment procedures that were apparently necessary to maintain the property safely. By the 1980s, the journal entries had become completely cryptic, filled with references to feeding schedules, rotation cycles, and detailed weather observations that seemed to correlate with periods of increased activity. The most disturbing aspect of Ezra's journals was the recurring mention of the collection and his responsibility for keeping them satisfied. The entries suggested that the property housed something that required regular attention and care, something that had been passed down through the Briggs family for generations, along with specific instructions for its management. Ezra's handwriting became increasingly erratic in the final years of his journals, and his last entry, dated just 3 weeks before his death, consisted of a single sentence repeated 47 times. "They know I'm dying, and they're getting hungry." Nathaniel's first night in the farmhouse was disrupted by sounds that seemed to come from the forest surrounding the property. What began as normal nighttime woodland sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, gradually evolved into something far more disturbing. By midnight, the forest had filled with what sounded like human voices engaged in conversation. But the words were in a language Nathaniel didn't recognize, and the vocal tones suggested speakers with anatomy that wasn't quite human. The conversations seemed to be coming from directly outside the farmhouse windows. But when Nathaniel looked out into the darkness, he saw nothing but the familiar silhouettes of the oak trees. The next morning, Nathaniel discovered the first of what Ezra's journals referred to as the historical structures. Hidden behind the farmhouse and partially concealed by decades of overgrowth was a stone building that appeared to predate the farmhouse by at least a century. The structure was built into the side of a natural hill, with only its front wall and entrance visible from the outside. The stonework was unlike anything Nathaniel had ever seen, composed of irregularly shaped blocks that fit together with mathematical precision, despite having no visible mortar or binding agent holding them in place. The entrance to the stone building was secured with a heavy wooden door bound with iron strapping that showed signs of recent maintenance, despite the structure's obvious age. Multiple locks of different eras secured the door, from ancient hand-forged mechanisms to modern industrial padlocks. And Nathaniel found the complete set of keys hanging on a hook inside the farmhouse kitchen, with a note in Ezra's handwriting. "Feed them every 3 days. Raw meat only. Never enter after sunset. Never feed them when the moon is dark. If you hear them speaking English, leave the property immediately." Against every instinct he possessed, Nathaniel's curiosity compelled him to investigate what his family had been hiding for generations. Using Ezra's keys, he unlocked the multiple security devices and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior of the stone building was larger than its external dimensions suggested, extending deep into the hillside through a series of chambers connected by narrow passages carved directly from the bedrock. The walls were covered with the same type of intricate carvings that seemed to be a recurring motif in stories from throughout Appalachia. Symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles. But it was what occupied the chambers that made Nathaniel understand why his family had maintained this terrible secret for so many generations. Each chamber contained what appeared to be a person, but closer examination revealed that these weren't living humans in any conventional sense. They were incredibly ancient, their skin dried and preserved like leather. Yet they moved and responded to stimuli as if they were still alive. Their eyes were completely white, without pupils or irises. Yet Nathaniel could feel them tracking his movement through the chambers with unnatural awareness. The preserved figures wore clothing from different historical periods, suggesting they had been collected over the course of centuries. Some wore the homespun garments of early American settlers, others the more refined dress of Victorian-era citizens, and a few were clothed in styles that predated European colonization of the mountains entirely. Despite their obviously ancient condition, they moved with fluid grace, their movements eerily synchronized, as if they were parts of a single organism rather than individual entities. As Nathaniel explored deeper into the underground complex, he discovered that the chambers formed an intricate pattern that matched the arrangement of the oak trees surrounding the farmhouse above ground. Each chamber was connected to its neighbors by a network of tunnels that created a vast underground mirror of the forest canopy. At the center of this subterranean maze was a circular chamber larger than all the others, its walls covered with carvings that were far more complex and detailed than anything Nathaniel had seen in the outer chambers. The central chamber contained what appeared to be an altar carved from the same mysterious stone as the building's walls. But the altar's surface was stained with substances that Nathaniel preferred not to examine too closely. Arranged around the altar were dozens of objects that appeared to be offerings of some kind. Jewelry, tools, weapons, and personal items that spanned centuries of human occupation in the mountains. But most disturbing were the journals and written records that documented the Briggs family's stewardship of this place. Records that revealed a history of human sacrifice and ritual feeding that stretched back to the family's arrival in Appalachia in the 1760s. According to the family records, the preserved figures in the chambers weren't just ancient corpses. They were something that had once been human, but had been transformed through rituals that bound their consciousness to the mountain itself. They served as guardians for something even more ancient that slept deep beneath the bedrock, something that required regular feeding to prevent it from waking and seeking nourishment from the wider world. The Briggs family had been chosen as caretakers generations ago, bound by blood oaths and ancestral obligations to maintain the feeding schedule and perform the rituals necessary to keep the deeper presence dormant. As Nathaniel read through the family records, he began to understand the true horror of his inheritance. The preserved figures weren't just passive guardians. They were recruiters, actively working to identify new caretakers when the current generation grew old or died. They had been watching him since his arrival, evaluating his suitability for the role that had been thrust upon him by his great-uncle's death. And according to the records, those who attempted to abandon their responsibilities or flee the property never made it beyond the circle of oak trees that surrounded the farmhouse. The sound of movement in the tunnels behind him made Nathaniel realize that his exploration had not gone unnoticed. The preserved figures were converging on the central chamber, their synchronized movements creating a rhythm that echoed through the stone passages like a heartbeat. As they entered the circular chamber, Nathaniel could hear them speaking in the same strange language he had heard the night before. But now he understood that they weren't just having conversations. They were performing some kind of ritual that was drawing power from the altar at the chamber's center. Nathaniel fled toward the surface, but the tunnel system seemed to have changed during his exploration. Passages that had led toward the entrance now curved back toward the central chamber, and new openings had appeared in the walls that led to chambers he hadn't seen before. The preserved figures followed him through the maze, their voices growing louder and more insistent as they spoke in languages that predated human civilization, words that seemed to resonate directly in his bones and make his vision blur with their otherworldly harmonics. When Nathaniel finally reached the stone building's entrance, he found the heavy wooden door sealed shut from the outside, secured with locks that hadn't been there when he entered. The preserved figures surrounded him in the entry chamber, their white eyes reflecting light that wasn't coming from any visible source. As they reached toward him with hands that felt like ancient leather, Nathaniel understood that his great-uncle's death hadn't been natural. It had been a carefully planned transition that would bind the next generation to the family's terrible obligation. Nathaniel Briggs was found 3 days later by county deputies conducting a welfare check requested by concerned neighbors who had reported strange lights and sounds coming from the abandoned property. They discovered him sitting calmly on the farmhouse porch, staring at the circle of oak trees with the same white, pupilless eyes that had haunted the mountains for centuries. When questioned about his experience, Nathaniel spoke only in that ancient language that seemed to hurt the officer's ears, and he showed no recognition of his former identity or any memory of his life before arriving at the property. The inheritance papers have been transferred to Nathaniel's younger sister Sarah, who lives in California and has never visited the family property in Tennessee. Local residents have begun reporting the same strange sounds and conversations coming from the forest around the old Briggs place, and the Postal Service has quietly resumed their policy of refusing to deliver mail to the property. The cycle continues as it has for generations, waiting patiently for the next family member to claim their birthright and discover the true cost of their Appalachian heritage. Story 5. The Developer's Mistake. Construction foreman Jake Morrison had supervised the development of over 200 residential projects across 3 states. But the luxury cabin community he was building in the mountains of North Carolina would become his final job. The project, called Whispering Pines Retreat, was designed to be an exclusive collection of high-end vacation homes for wealthy clients from Charlotte and Atlanta who wanted a private escape in the pristine wilderness of the Blue Ridge Mountains. What Jake and his crew didn't know was that they were building on land that had been deliberately left undeveloped for over 2 centuries, protected by agreements between local Cherokee families and early European settlers who understood that some places were meant to remain untouched by human habitation. The warning signs began during the initial surveying phase in March 2021, when Jake's crew discovered that their GPS equipment consistently malfunctioned in certain areas of the property. Compass readings would spin wildly, and electronic devices would shut down without explanation whenever they approached a cluster of ancient trees at the property's center. The local surveyor they had hired, an elderly man named Robert Littlefeather, whose family had lived in these mountains for generations, warned Jake that the land was protected by old agreements and suggested they modify their development plans to avoid disturbing the central grove. Jake dismissed Robert's concerns as local superstition and ordered his crew to begin clearing the entire property according to the original architectural plans. The ancient trees at the property's center were massive specimens, some over 300 years old, and their removal required specialized equipment and careful coordination to avoid damaging the surrounding forest. As Jake's crew began cutting into the first of the ancient oaks, they discovered that the tree's root systems were far more extensive than anything they had encountered before, with massive underground networks that seemed to connect all the trees in an intricate web beneath the forest floor. The first supernatural incident occurred on the third day of tree removal, when heavy equipment operator Danny Reeves reported that his bulldozer was being pushed back by some invisible force every time he attempted to approach the central grove. Danny was a 20-year veteran of construction work who had operated heavy machinery in every conceivable terrain and weather condition. But he swore that something was physically preventing his equipment from moving forward despite full engine power and optimal traction conditions. When Jake climbed into the bulldozer cab to see for himself, he experienced the same phenomenon. The machine would simply stop moving forward, as if it had encountered an immovable barrier, despite the absence of any visible obstruction. Jake's crew began experiencing increasingly disturbing incidents as they continued their work around the central grove. Tools would disappear from job sites overnight and reappear in impossible locations, buried deep in the ground or wedged high in tree branches that no human could reach without specialized climbing equipment. Workers reported feeling constantly watched while on the job site, and several crew members complained of chronic nightmares featuring the same recurring imagery: vast underground spaces filled with roots that moved like living things and voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The situation escalated dramatically when Jake decided to ignore the equipment problems and ordered his crew to use explosives to remove the largest trees in the central grove. The blast that was supposed to uproot a 300-year-old oak instead opened a sinkhole that revealed an underground chamber system that wasn't shown on any geological survey of the area. The chamber appeared to be natural, carved from limestone by underground water flow, but its walls were covered with symbols and carvings that bore an unsettling resemblance to Cherokee pictographs, mixed with designs that seemed far older than any known Native American artwork. Against the advice of Robert Littlefeather and several of his more experienced crew members, Jake decided to investigate the underground chamber system to determine if it posed any structural risks to the planned construction. What he found beneath the forest floor challenged everything he thought he knew about the history of human occupation in the Appalachian Mountains. The chambers formed an extensive network that stretched for hundreds of yards in every direction, connected by passages that had been carved with precision tools that left marks unlike anything made by traditional Native American implements. The walls of the underground chambers were covered with what appeared to be a historical record, painted and carved imagery that documented thousands of years of human activity in the area. But the history depicted in these underground galleries contradicted everything Jake had learned about regional archaeology and anthropology. The images showed encounters between early human inhabitants and beings that were clearly not human, creatures that emerged from deep caves and underground spaces to interact with surface dwellers through complex rituals and agreements. Jake's exploration of the chamber system led him to a central space that appeared to serve as some kind of ceremonial hall, its ceiling supported by natural stone pillars that had been carved with the same mysterious symbols found throughout the network. At the center of this chamber was a circular depression in the floor that had been filled with objects that spanned thousands of years of human presence in the mountains. Stone tools, pottery fragments, metal implements, and modern items that included watches, jewelry, and electronic devices that Jake recognized as belonging to his missing crew members. As Jake documented the chamber with his camera, he began to understand that the underground space wasn't just a historical site. It was still actively used for its original purpose. The objects in the central depression weren't archaeological artifacts, but offerings, contributions to some ongoing agreement between the human inhabitants of the surface world and whatever dwelled in the deeper chambers beneath the mountain. The realization that his crew members' missing tools and equipment had found their way into this underground collection suggested that the ancient protocols were still being observed by someone or something. The mechanical sounds that Jake had been hearing since entering the chamber system grew louder as he approached the passages that led deeper into the mountain. The sounds weren't coming from construction equipment or any machinery he recognized, but rather from some organic process that created rhythms and harmonics that seemed designed to resonate through the limestone caves. As Jake followed the sounds deeper into the mountain, he discovered chambers that contained what appeared to be a thriving ecosystem of creatures that had never seen sunlight but had evolved in perfect adaptation to their underground environment. But these weren't typical cave-dwelling animals. The creatures Jake encountered in the deeper chambers showed clear signs of intelligence and tool use, building complex structures from stone and organic materials and maintaining what appeared to be agricultural systems that produced food from minerals and cave formations. Most disturbing was their obvious awareness of Jake's presence and their apparent familiarity with surface dwellers, suggesting that contact between the underground community and humans had been ongoing for centuries. Jake's camera began malfunctioning as he encountered larger groups of the underground dwellers, the digital display showing images that weren't there and recording sounds at frequencies that made his ears ache. Through the distorted viewfinder, he could see that the creatures were attempting to communicate with him using the same pictographic symbols that covered the chamber walls, gesturing toward passages that led even deeper into the mountain, while making sounds that seemed to follow complex linguistic patterns. The understanding that dawned on Jake in those deep chambers filled him with a horror that transcended anything he had ever experienced. The land his company was developing wasn't just environmentally protected or historically significant. It was part of an ancient treaty between surface humans and an entire civilization that existed beneath the mountains. The agreements that Robert Littlefeather had mentioned weren't just Native American traditions, but active diplomatic protocols that had maintained peace between two different forms of human life for thousands of years. Jake's attempt to flee the underground chamber system was complicated by the fact that the passages had changed during his exploration, rearranging themselves according to patterns that suggested the entire network was somehow alive and responsive to the needs of its inhabitants. Tunnels that had led toward the surface now curved deeper into the mountain, and new openings had appeared that led to chambers filled with more of the underground dwellers, all of them watching Jake with an intelligence that suggested they were evaluating his suitability for some purpose he didn't want to understand. When Jake finally reached the surface through a combination of luck and determination, he found that his construction site had been completely transformed during his time underground. The heavy equipment had been arranged in precise geometric patterns that matched the symbols he had seen in the caves, and his crew members were nowhere to be found. Their personal vehicles remained in the parking area, keys still in the ignitions, but the men themselves had vanished without leaving any trace of their departure. Jake Morrison never completed the Whispering Pines retreat project. He abandoned the construction site that same day and never returned to collect his equipment or settle his contracts with the development company. The property has remained undeveloped, protected by legal complications that seem to multiply whenever anyone attempts to resume construction activities. Local residents report that the ancient grove at the property's center has somehow regenerated, with new trees growing at impossible rates to replace those that were cut down during the aborted development project. Robert Littlefeather continues to serve as a caretaker for the property, maintaining the old agreements through rituals and offerings that ensure the underground civilization remains hidden from the surface world. He reports that Jake's missing crew members occasionally emerge from the cave system, but they have been changed by their time below ground and no longer show any interest in returning to their former lives. They speak in the same linguistic patterns Jake heard in the deep chambers, and their eyes have adapted to the darkness in ways that make them uncomfortable in surface daylight. The development company has written off the Whispering Pines project as a total loss, but they've made no effort to reclaim their equipment or investigate the circumstances of their crew's disappearance. The official reports blame construction delays and environmental complications, but the real reason the project was abandoned remains buried in classified files that will never see public disclosure. The mountains keep their secrets, and the ancient agreements continue to protect both civilizations from conflicts that could destroy the delicate balance that has existed beneath Appalachia for thousands of years. Story 6. The Bloodlines Return. Dr. Catherine Sloan had spent 15 years researching her family genealogy when she discovered that her ancestors had once owned vast tracts of land in the remote mountains of Virginia, property that had been mysteriously sold for almost nothing in 1889 and never spoken of again in any family records. The discovery came through a probate document she found in the basement archives of the Wise County Courthouse, a legal filing that indicated her great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Sloan had deeded over 800 acres of prime mountain land to the state of Virginia for the token sum of $1, with the stipulation that the land never be developed or opened for public access. What the document didn't explain was why Jeremiah had abandoned a property that represented the family's entire wealth, or why subsequent generations of Sloans had never attempted to reclaim what should have been a valuable inheritance. Catherine's interest in the abandoned family land became an obsession after she discovered that the property was still legally restricted from development or public access, protected by environmental regulations that seemed unusually comprehensive for land that had no apparent ecological significance. Her research revealed that the Sloan family had been among the earliest European settlers in that region of Virginia, arriving in the 1760s and establishing what contemporary records described as a thriving farming community that traded extensively with Cherokee settlements deeper in the mountains. But sometime in the 1880s, all references to the Sloan property simply disappeared from local records, as if an entire branch of her family tree had been deliberately erased from history. Catherine's attempts to gain access to the abandoned property were initially blocked by state environmental agencies that cited concerns about disturbing sensitive wildlife habitats. But her persistence eventually led her to a retired state forester named William Crenshaw, who had worked in that region for over 40 years. William was reluctant to discuss the Sloan property, but he eventually revealed that state forestry services had been maintaining special protocols for that particular tract of land since the early 1900s. Protocols that included regular monitoring visits and the maintenance of what he described as containment structures that were never detailed in any official documentation. In September 2023, Catherine finally gained permission to visit the property as part of a family heritage research project, accompanied by William Crenshaw and a state environmental specialist named Dr. James Morrison, who seemed unusually nervous about the expedition. The drive to the property took them deep into national forest land on roads that weren't marked on any public maps, following routes that William navigated from memory rather than GPS coordinates. As they approached the Sloan family land, Catherine began to understand why her ancestors had abandoned such a beautiful and valuable property. There was something fundamentally wrong with the area that became more apparent with every mile they traveled deeper into the mountains. The forest around the old Sloan property was eerily quiet, lacking the bird songs and insect sounds that had been constant during their drive through the surrounding national forest. The trees grew in unnatural patterns, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly, and the undergrowth was sparse despite the rich soil and abundant rainfall that should have supported dense vegetation. Most disturbing were the structures that William referred to as containment barriers. Stone walls and metal fencing that formed geometric patterns throughout the forest, apparently designed to channel foot traffic along specific routes while blocking access to other areas of the property. Catherine's first glimpse of her family's original homestead explained why the Sloanes had fled this land and never spoken of it again. The farmhouse and outbuildings were still standing after more than a century of abandonment. But they showed signs of damage that couldn't be attributed to normal weathering or decay. The wooden structures were covered in what appeared to be claw marks from something large enough to reach the second-story windows. And the stone foundation of the main house had been cracked and shifted as if the ground beneath it had been disturbed by tremendous force from below. Inside the abandoned farmhouse, Catherine discovered that her ancestors had left behind far more than just furniture and household goods. Hidden in a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor was a collection of journals, photographs, and documents that revealed the true history of the Sloane family's time on the mountain property. The records painted a picture of a community that had initially thrived through trade relationships with local Cherokee families, but had gradually become involved in activities that went far beyond normal commercial exchanges. According to the family records, the Sloanes had been recruited by their Cherokee trading partners to serve as guardians for something that was buried deep beneath the mountain, something that required regular monitoring and specific rituals to keep it dormant. The responsibility had been passed down through Cherokee families for generations, but the increasing pressure of European settlement and forced relocations had made it impossible for the original guardians to continue their work. The Sloanes had agreed to take on the guardianship role in exchange for detailed knowledge about the mountain's mineral wealth and the locations of valuable natural resources. The family journals revealed that the guardianship duties involved far more than Catherine had imagined. The Sloanes were responsible for maintaining a complex system of barriers and containment structures that prevented something from emerging from deep cave systems beneath the property. And they performed regular rituals that involved offerings of food, tools, and occasionally more valuable items that were lowered into specific cave entrances on a carefully maintained schedule. But most disturbing were the references to the bloodline obligation that bound the Sloane family to their guardianship duties through genetic connections that made them uniquely suited to communicate with whatever was contained beneath the mountain. As Catherine read through generations of family records, she began to understand that her ancestors hadn't just been guardians. They had been in active communication with an intelligence that lived in the deep cave systems beneath the property. The journals described regular meetings between family members and entities that were described as the old ones who remember the time before humans, beings that possessed knowledge about the mountain's geological history and the location of valuable resources that had made the Sloanes wealthy through mining and trading activities. The final entries in Jeremiah Sloane's journal revealed why the family had ultimately abandoned their profitable guardianship role. Something had changed in the deep caves during the 1880s, and the entities that had been content to remain hidden for generations began demanding more substantial offerings and expressing interest in expanding their influence beyond the confines of their underground realm. Jeremiah's last entry described a series of meetings with the underground beings that had culminated in demands that the Sloane family provide human sacrifices to feed something that was growing stronger and more active in the deepest chambers beneath the mountain. Catherine's exploration of the property with William and Dr. Morrison led her to the cave system that her ancestors had guarded for over a century. The main entrance was hidden behind one of the containment barriers, secured with modern locks that showed evidence of regular maintenance, despite the property's supposed abandonment. Dr. Morrison produced keys for the locks with obvious reluctance, explaining that state forestry services had continued the Sloane family's guardianship role since 1889, maintaining the containment protocols and monitoring the cave system for signs of increased activity. The cave entrance led to a natural limestone system that had been modified by human construction over the course of centuries. The passages were lined with stonework that showed evidence of both Cherokee craftsmanship and European construction techniques, creating a hybrid architectural style that reflected the collaborative nature of the original guardianship agreement. But as Catherine ventured deeper into the cave system, she encountered modifications that were far older than either Cherokee or European settlement. Stonework that appeared to predate human civilization in the Americas entirely. The deep chambers of the cave system contained evidence of a thriving ecosystem that existed completely independent of surface conditions. Catherine discovered spaces filled with vegetation that had never seen sunlight, but had evolved into complex forms that seemed to combine plant and animal characteristics. More disturbing were the structures that occupied the deepest chambers, buildings carved from living rock that showed clear signs of intelligent design, but followed architectural principles that were completely alien to human construction methods. As Catherine explored the underground complex, she began to encounter the beings that her family had served as guardians for over a century. They were clearly intelligent and possessing. Story 7. The Community's Secret. Sarah Mitchell thought she had found the perfect place to raise her family when she moved to the small mountain community of Cedar Hollow, North Carolina, in the spring of 2019. The town of just under 300 residents seemed like an idyllic escape from the chaos of urban life, with friendly neighbors who welcomed newcomers with homemade pies and invitations to community gatherings. What Sarah didn't realize was that Cedar Hollow's welcoming atmosphere masked a collective secret that had kept the community isolated and self-sufficient for over 2 centuries. A secret that required the participation of every adult resident and the careful indoctrination of each new generation born into the town's hidden legacy. Sarah's first indication that something was unusual about Cedar Hollow came during her 3rd week in town, when she noticed that several of her neighbors seemed to operate on schedules that didn't correspond to normal work patterns or social activities. People would leave their homes at odd hours of the night, always in small groups, carrying supplies and equipment that seemed more suited to industrial work than anything that should exist in a rural mountain community. When Sarah asked her neighbor Helen Crenshaw about the nighttime activities, Helen explained that the town maintained several community projects that required work during cooler evening hours. But she was vague about the specific nature of these projects. Sarah's curiosity about the mysterious community activities intensified when she discovered that Cedar Hollow wasn't connected to the regional electrical grid, despite having reliable power throughout the town. The community generated its own electricity through what residents described as hydroelectric systems powered by mountain streams. But Sarah's background in environmental engineering made her skeptical about the feasibility of such systems providing sufficient power for an entire town. Her inquiries about the power generation facilities were met with polite deflections and suggestions that she focus on settling into her new home before concerning herself with technical infrastructure details. The first community meeting Sarah attended in June 2019 revealed the extent to which Cedar Hollow operated as a completely self-contained society with minimal contact with the outside world. The meeting was led by Mayor Thomas Blackwood, whose family had apparently governed the town for 6 generations, and the agenda focused entirely on internal community matters, with no reference to county, state, or federal issues that typically concern municipal governments. Most disturbing was the casual way residents discussed production quotas and delivery schedules that seemed to indicate the town was engaged in some form of manufacturing or resource extraction that wasn't apparent from surface observations. Sarah's attempts to explore the areas around Cedar Hollow were consistently frustrated by residents who insisted that the mountain terrain was too dangerous for inexperienced hikers, and that certain areas were prone to sudden weather changes that could trap unwary visitors. Every trail leading away from the town center was monitored by volunteers who claimed to be concerned about visitor safety, but who seemed more interested in discouraging exploration than providing helpful guidance. When Sarah persisted in her attempts to hike the surrounding mountains, she discovered that many of the trails simply ended at sheer cliff faces or impassable ravines. as if the town had been deliberately built in a location that was nearly impossible to leave on foot. The true nature of Cedar Hollow's secret began to reveal itself during Sarah's first autumn in the community, when she was invited to participate in what residents called the Harvest Festival. The celebration began with typical small-town activities: a potluck dinner, live music, and children's games. But as evening approached, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Adults began organizing into work groups with military-like efficiency, and Sarah realized that the festival was actually a cover for a massive community operation that involved nearly every resident of the town. Sarah followed her assigned work group to a facility hidden in the forest behind the town center, a complex of buildings that were completely invisible from the main roads and residential areas. The facility was far more sophisticated than anything that should exist in a rural mountain community, with industrial equipment and laboratories that looked like they belonged in a major research institution. Her work group leader, Dr. Patricia Vance, explained that Cedar Hollow had been established as a research community in the early 1800s, dedicated to studying what she described as unique geological phenomena that occurred naturally in the surrounding mountains. The research facility contained specimens and equipment that challenged Sarah's understanding of both natural science and human technology. She observed laboratories where scientists were studying rock formations that appeared to be growing and changing in real time, and chambers where researchers monitored what appeared to be communication signals coming from deep underground sources. Most disturbing were the containment areas, where the community was apparently housing living specimens of creatures that Dr. Vance described as evolutionary variants that had developed in isolation within the mountain's cave systems. As Sarah learned more about the research being conducted in Cedar Hollow, she began to understand that the community wasn't just studying unusual natural phenomena. They were actively cultivating and harvesting resources from sources that existed deep beneath the mountains. The production quotas discussed at community meetings referred to quantities of materials that were being extracted from underground sources and processed in the hidden facilities. These materials were apparently valuable enough to support the entire community's economy, and sophisticated enough to require advanced scientific knowledge to handle safely. Dr. Vance explained that Cedar Hollow's residents were descendants of families who had been recruited for their specific scientific and technical skills over the course of 2 centuries, creating a community of specialists who were uniquely qualified to work with the unusual resources found beneath the mountains. The community operated under agreements with federal agencies that provided legal protection and funding in exchange for exclusive access to the materials and research data generated by their work. But these agreements also required absolute secrecy and complete isolation from the outside world. Sarah's role in the community became clear when Dr. Vance revealed that her background in environmental engineering made her an ideal candidate for managing the waste disposal systems that were necessary to safely process the underground materials. The work involved handling substances that were unlike anything in conventional chemistry or physics, materials that required specialized containment procedures and disposal methods that had been developed through decades of trial and error by previous generations of Cedar Hollow residents. The underground materials being processed by the community weren't just unusual. They were actively dangerous in ways that challenged conventional understanding of matter and energy. Sarah learned that the substances could affect living tissue at the molecular level, causing mutations and changes that could be passed on to offspring if proper precautions weren't followed. The community's medical facilities were equipped to monitor residents for exposure effects and provide treatments that prevented the materials from causing permanent damage. But everyone who worked with the substances carried genetic markers that would be passed on to their children. As Sarah became more deeply involved in the community's work, she discovered that Cedar Hollow's isolation wasn't just about maintaining secrecy. It was about protecting the outside world from contamination. by materials that could fundamentally alter human biology if they were released into the general population. The community served as both a research facility and a containment system, ensuring that the dangerous substances remained under scientific control while their properties were studied and their potential applications were developed. The most horrifying aspect of Sarah's initiation into Cedar Hollow's secret was the realization that leaving the community was no longer possible once she had been exposed to the underground materials. The genetic changes caused by handling the substances created a dependency that required regular medical treatments available only within the community's specialized facilities. Residents who attempted to leave Cedar Hollow would eventually die from complications related to their altered biology, making the community a permanent home for anyone who became involved in its research activities. Sarah's attempts to contact authorities outside Cedar Hollow were blocked by communication systems that were apparently monitored and controlled by the same federal agencies that funded the community's research. Her phone calls were redirected to recorded messages. Her internet access was restricted to approved sites, and her mail was intercepted before it could leave the town. The community's isolation was maintained through technological means as well as geographical barriers, creating a closed system that prevented any information about the research from reaching the outside world. Dr. Vance revealed that Sarah's arrival in Cedar Hollow hadn't been coincidental. The community actively recruited new residents with specific skills when their research required additional expertise. Sarah's background and financial situation had been carefully evaluated before she was directed to the available property in Cedar Hollow, and her integration into the community had been planned from the moment she first contacted the local real estate agent. The friendly welcome she had received from her neighbors was part of a carefully orchestrated process designed to ease new residents into their roles within the community's secret operations. Sarah Mitchell remains a resident of Cedar Hollow, North Carolina, working as a senior environmental engineer in the community's underground processing facilities. Her children attend the local school, where they receive an education that prepares them for eventual roles in the family business of managing humanity's most dangerous secrets. She occasionally writes letters to friends and family members outside the community, letters that are carefully reviewed and edited before being sent, describing her happy life in a charming mountain town, where everyone looks out for their neighbors and traditional values are preserved for future generations. The federal agencies that oversee Cedar Hollow's operations maintain the community's cover story through property records and tax documents that portray it as a typical rural town with a small population of retirees and telecommuters. Satellite imagery of the area is routinely altered to hide the industrial facilities, and GPS systems are programmed to route traffic away from the access roads that lead to the community. The work continues as it has for over 2 centuries, hidden in plain sight within the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, where some secrets are too important to share with a world that isn't ready to understand the true nature of what lies beneath the ancient rocks and dark waters of America's oldest mountain range. Story 8. The Signal in the Mountains. Radio engineer David Park thought he was investigating routine interference reports when he was assigned to trace the source of mysterious radio signals that had been disrupting emergency communications throughout the mountains of eastern West Virginia in the fall of 2022. The signals appeared to be coming from somewhere deep in the Monongahela National Forest, broadcasting on frequencies that were supposed to be reserved for federal emergency services. But the content of the transmissions defied explanation. Instead of standard emergency communications or even illegal pirate broadcasts, the signals consisted of what appeared to be human voices speaking in languages that linguistic experts couldn't identify, mixed with sounds that resembled both mechanical processes and organic biological functions. David's investigation began with standard radio direction finding equipment that should have quickly pinpointed the source of the interference. but the mysterious signals seemed to originate from multiple locations simultaneously, creating triangulation readings that suggested the broadcasts were coming from an area covering nearly 50 square miles of mountainous terrain. More disturbing was the fact that the signals grew stronger at night and seemed to respond to attempts to trace them, increasing in power and complexity whenever David's equipment locked onto their frequency. The interference was affecting critical emergency services communications across 3 counties. But federal communications authorities seemed reluctant to authorize a comprehensive investigation into the source. David's first expedition into the forest to locate the signal source was accompanied by Forest Service Ranger Maria Santos and electronics technician Robert Kim, both of whom had experience with communication equipment installations in remote locations. Their radio direction finding equipment led them deep into areas of the national forest that were rarely visited by hikers or researchers. Following valleys and ridges that seemed to naturally amplify and channel radio waves in unusual ways. As they hiked deeper into the mountains, David noticed that their handheld radios began picking up the mysterious signals with increasing clarity. But the content became more disturbing the stronger the reception became. The signals weren't random transmissions, but appeared to be part of ongoing conversations between multiple participants. Discussions that suggested the broadcasters were coordinating complex activities across a wide geographical area. David's training in signal analysis allowed him to identify at least 6 distinct voices participating in the broadcasts, each speaking from different locations, but apparently able to hear and respond to the others in real time. More unsettling was the gradual realization that some of the conversation topics referenced current events and local news stories with a level of detail that suggested the broadcasters had access to information sources beyond what should be available in remote forest locations. David's team discovered the first physical evidence of the signal source when they found a communications installation hidden in a natural cave system about 15 miles from the nearest marked trail. The equipment was unlike anything David had encountered in 20 years of radio engineering, combining components that appeared to be military surplus with devices that didn't match any civilian or government technology he recognized. The installation was clearly sophisticated and recently maintained, with power systems that seemed to operate independently of any external electrical grid and antenna arrays that had been carefully concealed to avoid detection by aerial surveys. The cave system housing the communication equipment extended far deeper into the mountain than David had expected, with passages that led to additional chambers containing more broadcasting equipment and what appeared to be living quarters for multiple occupants. The deeper chambers were equipped with facilities that suggested long-term habitation, including food storage areas, sleeping quarters, and workshops filled with electronic equipment and tools. Most disturbing were the detailed maps and charts that covered the walls of several chambers, showing the locations of communication installations throughout the Appalachian mountain range and indicating a network of hidden broadcasting sites that spanned multiple states. As David explored the communication facility, he began to understand that the mysterious radio signals were part of a coordinated network that had been operating in the mountains for decades, possibly longer. The equipment showed evidence of continuous upgrades and modifications over many years, with newer digital components integrated with older analog systems in ways that suggested both technical sophistication and extensive operational experience. The broadcasts weren't random interference, but were part of a communication system that served some organized group that had established a permanent presence in the remote areas of the national forest. David's analysis of the broadcasting equipment revealed that the mysterious signals were being transmitted with far more power than should be possible from portable installations, suggesting access to energy sources that weren't apparent from surface observations. The antenna systems were designed to penetrate deep underground, indicating that at least part of the communication network was intended to reach recipients in subterranean locations. Most unsettling was the discovery of recording equipment that had been documenting local emergency services communications for years, suggesting that whoever operated the hidden network had been systematically monitoring law enforcement and emergency response activities across the region. The content of the mysterious broadcasts became more comprehensible to David as he spent more time in the cave system, gradually developing an understanding of the linguistic patterns and technical terminology used by the participants. The conversations revealed that the network served a community of people who lived permanently in hidden locations throughout the mountains, coordinating activities that included resource gathering, territory monitoring, and what appeared to be scientific research projects that required careful secrecy. The broadcasters referred to themselves using titles and designations that suggested a highly organized society with specialized roles and hierarchical structures. David's discovery of the communication network's true purpose came when he accessed archived recordings that documented years of broadcasts and revealed the historical development of the hidden mountain community. The recordings showed that the network had originated as a communication system for families who had retreated into the mountains during the Great Depression and had gradually evolved into something far more complex as successive generations had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for remaining hidden from outside authorities. The community had grown to include individuals with advanced technical and scientific training who had chosen to abandon mainstream society in favor of life in the hidden mountain settlements. The most disturbing aspect of David's investigation was the realization that the mountain community had been actively recruiting new members through carefully planned contact with individuals who possessed specific skills or knowledge that could contribute to their hidden society. The archived recordings included detailed discussions about potential recruits, including surveillance reports and personality profiles that demonstrated extensive research into the backgrounds and capabilities of targeted individuals. David recognized several names from the recruitment discussions, including his own, suggesting that his assignment to investigate the radio interference hadn't been coincidental. As David attempted to leave the cave system with evidence of the hidden communication network, he discovered that the facility's occupants had returned and were monitoring his activities through surveillance systems he hadn't noticed during his initial exploration. The voices from the radio broadcasts were now coming from speakers throughout the cave system, but the participants were no longer speaking in the unidentified languages David had heard before. They were addressing him directly in English, discussing his qualifications for joining their community, and the impossibility of allowing him to return to the outside world with knowledge of their existence. The members of the hidden mountain community who confronted David in the cave system appeared to be normal humans, but their behavior and mannerisms suggested they had lived in isolation for so long that they had developed social patterns and communication styles that were distinctly different from mainstream society. They explained that their community had been established to preserve knowledge and skills that they believed would be essential for human survival during future catastrophic events, and that their secrecy was necessary to protect their work from interference by government authorities and corporate interests that wouldn't understand the importance of their research. David's recruitment into the mountain community was presented as an opportunity rather than a threat, with community leaders explaining that his technical expertise would be valuable for expanding and improving their communication network. They offered him a choice between joining their society voluntarily or being held in the cave system until he agreed to participate in their activities, making it clear that returning to his previous life wasn't an option now that he had discovered their existence. The community's isolation from mainstream society was maintained through careful management of anyone who accidentally encountered their hidden installations. David Park never returned from his investigation into the mysterious radio signals, and his disappearance was eventually attributed to an accident in the remote mountain terrain, where rescue teams were unable to locate any trace of his equipment or remains. The interference affecting emergency communications in the area gradually ceased, leading authorities to conclude that the source had been natural atmospheric phenomena rather than human-generated broadcasts. The Forest Service has quietly restricted access to the areas where David conducted his investigation, citing concerns about unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife habitats. The hidden communication network continues to operate in the mountains of West Virginia, but the broadcasts have moved to frequencies and locations that avoid detection by conventional monitoring systems. Local residents occasionally report hearing strange voices coming from their radios during severe weather conditions, voices that seem to be discussing topics and using terminology that suggests knowledge of events and technologies beyond what should be available in remote mountain locations. The community that David discovered continues to grow, recruiting new members from individuals whose disappearances in the national forest are attributed to the natural hazards of exploring America's oldest and most unforgiving mountain wilderness. Story 9. The Watchers in the Hollow Anthropologist. Dr. Amanda Rivers came to the remote hollow of Thornwick, Kentucky, in November 2021 to document what she believed were the final traces of an isolated Appalachian dialect that was rapidly disappearing. As younger residents moved away from the mountains in search of economic opportunities, the hollow was home to fewer than 40 residents, most of them elderly members of 3 interconnected families who had lived in the area for over 2 centuries. What Dr. Rivers didn't know was that the linguistic patterns she had come to study weren't just remnants of archaic English dialects, but were actually a carefully preserved communication system that had been developed to discuss subjects that couldn't be safely addressed in conventional language. The residents of Thornwick Hollow were initially welcoming to Dr. Rivers, inviting her to stay in a cabin that had been built specifically for visiting researchers and offering to share their knowledge of local history and traditional ways of life. The elderly matriarch of the community, Granny Essie Thornwick, seemed particularly interested in Dr. Rivers' academic credentials and asked detailed questions about her research methods and the institutions that had funded her work. But as Dr. Rivers began conducting formal interviews and recording sessions, she noticed that the residents' speech patterns changed dramatically depending on the topics being discussed and who else was present during the conversations. Dr. Rivers' linguistic training allowed her to identify subtle variations in vocabulary and grammar that suggested the Thornwick residents were code-switching between different communication systems depending on the context of their discussions. When talking about everyday subjects like farming, weather, or family relationships, they spoke in the archaic Appalachian dialect she had come to document. But when certain topics arose during conversation, they would shift to a linguistic pattern that incorporated vocabulary and grammatical structures that didn't match any known English dialect or any other language in Dr. Rivers' extensive database of linguistic variations. The mysterious linguistic patterns became more apparent during Dr. Rivers' 3rd week in the hollow, when she was invited to attend what Granny Essie described as a community meeting held in the basement of the local church. The gathering included all the adult residents of the hollow, and the discussion was conducted entirely in the unidentified language pattern that Dr. Rivers had been noticing during her interviews. As she listened to the meeting, she began to recognize recurring themes and vocabulary that suggested the participants were discussing surveillance activities, territorial boundaries, and what appeared to be scheduling for some kind of coordinated monitoring system. Dr. Rivers' attempts to record the community meeting were frustrated by equipment malfunctions that seemed to occur whenever the residents began speaking in their mysterious linguistic pattern. Her digital recording devices would shut down without explanation, her notebooks would somehow become illegible, and even her memory of specific conversations would become unclear within hours of hearing them. The residents seemed to understand that their alternative communication system had properties that interfered with conventional documentation methods, and they appeared to be deliberately preventing Dr. Rivers from creating any permanent record of their discussions. The true nature of the Thornwick community's secret became apparent when Dr. Rivers discovered that the residents weren't just preserving ancient linguistic traditions. They were actively participating in a surveillance network that monitored activity throughout the mountains of eastern Kentucky. The hollow was positioned at a strategic location that provided visual access to several mountain passes and valleys that served as primary routes for both legal and illegal traffic through the region. The residents had been observing and documenting all movement through their territory for generations, maintaining detailed records of who traveled through the area and when. Granny Essie eventually revealed that the Thornwick families had been recruited by federal agencies during the Civil War era to serve as intelligence gatherers in the remote mountain regions, where conventional law enforcement had limited effectiveness. The original agreement had involved monitoring Confederate sympathizers and Union deserters who used the mountain passes to avoid military authorities. But the arrangement had evolved over the decades to include surveillance of bootleggers during Prohibition, communist sympathizers during the Cold War, and drug traffickers in more recent years. The specialized language that Dr. Rivers had been attempting to document was actually a communications system that had been developed to allow the Thornwick residents to discuss their surveillance activities without being understood by outsiders who might overhear their conversations. The linguistic pattern incorporated elements of Cherokee, archaic English, and coded terminology that had been created specifically for describing surveillance techniques and reporting procedures. The language had been passed down through generations of families who had sworn oaths of secrecy to protect the nature of their work from outside interference. Dr. Rivers learned that the Thornwick Hollow was just one node in a larger network of surveillance communities that had been established throughout the Appalachian mountain range. Each group responsible for monitoring specific geographical areas and reporting unusual activities to federal agencies through communication channels that had remained secret for over a century. The residents of these communities received financial support and legal protection in exchange for their intelligence gathering services. But they were bound by agreements that required absolute secrecy about the nature of their work. The surveillance activities conducted by the Thornwick community were far more sophisticated than Dr. Rivers had initially realized. The residents possessed advanced optical equipment and communication devices that were disguised as typical mountain household items, and they maintained detailed databases of information about every person who traveled through their territory. The elderly residents who appeared to spend their days sitting on porches and tending gardens were actually conducting systematic observation of all movement in the surrounding mountains, using techniques that had been refined over generations of intelligence gathering. Dr. Rivers discovered that her own arrival in Thornwick had been carefully orchestrated by the federal agencies that coordinated the surveillance network. Her academic research had been funded through grants that were ultimately controlled by intelligence organizations, and her selection of the Thornwick dialect for study had been influenced by suggestions from academic advisors who were secretly working with the surveillance program. Her presence in the hollow served a dual purpose, providing cover for the residents' activities while allowing the agencies to evaluate her suitability for recruitment into the broader network. The realization that she had been manipulated into becoming part of the surveillance system filled Dr. Rivers with a horror that went beyond anything she had experienced in her academic career. The linguistic patterns she had come to document weren't just historical curiosities. They were active tools being used to coordinate intelligence-gathering activities that affected the lives and freedoms of countless people who traveled through the mountains. Her research was contributing to a system of surveillance that had operated in secret for over a century, hidden behind the facade of traditional mountain communities. Dr. Rivers' attempts to leave Thornwick and expose the surveillance network were blocked by the same agencies that had funded her research. Her academic credentials were quietly revoked due to ethical violations in her fieldwork. Her research materials were confiscated as classified information, and her attempts to contact journalists and civil rights organizations were intercepted before they could reach their intended recipients. The federal agencies that coordinated the mountain surveillance network had extensive resources for preventing exposure of their activities and discrediting anyone who threatened their secrecy. Granny Essie explained to Dr. Rivers that the surveillance network served essential national security functions that required absolute secrecy to remain effective. The mountain communities monitored activities that conventional law enforcement agencies couldn't track, including drug trafficking, human smuggling, and terrorist infiltration through remote border areas. The residents of places like Thornwick had sacrificed their privacy and freedom to serve their country in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. And their linguistic traditions were part of a cultural heritage that had been specifically developed to support intelligence-gathering activities. Dr. Rivers was given a choice between joining the surveillance network as a permanent resident of Thornwick or being relocated to a different remote community, where she would be monitored for the rest of her life to ensure her silence about what she had discovered. The federal agencies made it clear that her previous life as an academic researcher was over, regardless of which option she chose. But they offered her the opportunity to contribute her linguistic expertise to improving the communication systems used by the surveillance network. Dr. Amanda Rivers now lives permanently in Thornwick Hollow, Kentucky, where she serves as a linguistics specialist for a surveillance network that monitors activity throughout the Appalachian mountain range. Her academic publications are occasionally cited in linguistic journals, but her current research focuses on developing more sophisticated communication systems for intelligence-gathering activities that require absolute secrecy. She teaches the specialized language of surveillance to younger generations of mountain residents who will carry on the tradition of watching and listening in places where the outside world believes no one is paying attention. The Hollow remains a seemingly typical mountain community where elderly residents sit on porches and tend gardens, preserving traditional ways of life that appear to be disappearing throughout Appalachia. Visitors are welcomed with mountain hospitality and invited to learn about local history and dialect traditions, never suspecting that their every word and movement is being carefully documented by people whose linguistic heritage has been specifically designed to hide in plain sight. The Watchers continue their work as they have for generations, speaking in tongues that sound like echoes of America's past, while serving purposes that will never be acknowledged in the official histories of our mountain communities. Story 10. The Convergence at Devil's Backbone. Investigative journalist Mark Caldwell had spent 3 years researching the disappearances of over 24 people in the mountains of Appalachia when he finally discovered the connection that linked every case. Each victim had been investigating reports of unusual phenomena in a specific region of the Blue Ridge Mountains known locally as Devil's Backbone. The area encompassed portions of Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina, forming a triangular zone where geological surveys consistently reported anomalous readings, where wildlife behavior patterns defied conventional scientific explanation, and where local residents had maintained traditions of avoidance and superstition that stretched back to pre-Columbian times. Mark's investigation into the missing researchers, journalists, and government officials had led him to conclude that Devil's Backbone was the epicenter of something that connected all the strange incidents he had been documenting throughout the Appalachian region. Mark's research had begun with the disappearance of his colleague Jessica Chen, a geological surveyor who had vanished while investigating reports of unusual seismic activity in the Devil's Backbone region in 2020. Jessica's final communications had described discovering underground chambers that weren't shown on any geological survey. Chambers that contained structures and artifacts that challenged conventional understanding of both natural cave formation and human habitation patterns in pre-colonial America. Her last message had mentioned finding evidence of active geological processes that seemed to be controlled by some form of intelligence. But she had disappeared before she could provide specific details about her discoveries. As Mark investigated Jessica's disappearance, he discovered that she was part of a pattern that stretched back decades. Scientists, researchers, and government officials who investigated unusual phenomena in the Devil's Backbone region consistently vanished without trace, leaving behind equipment and notes that suggested they had all made similar discoveries about the true nature of what existed beneath the mountains. The missing persons included a park ranger who had reported encounters with non-human intelligence, a mining engineer who had discovered impossible geological formations, and a federal investigator who had been researching reports of advanced technology operating in remote mountain locations. Mark's investigation revealed that the federal government had been aware of unusual activity in the Devil's Backbone region since at least the 1940s, when military personnel had reported encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena and unknown ground-based installations during training exercises in the area. Classified documents that Mark obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, heavily redacted but still revealing, indicated that multiple federal agencies had conducted covert investigations into the region over several decades, with results that were apparently so sensitive that even the existence of the investigations had been classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The breakthrough in Mark's investigation came when he made contact with Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a retired federal scientist who had spent 20 years studying what she described as anomalous phenomena in the Appalachian mountain range before being forced into early retirement due to security concerns related to her research. Dr. Warren revealed that the Devil's Backbone region was one of several locations worldwide where conventional physics and geology appeared to operate according to different principles, creating conditions that allowed for the existence of phenomena that couldn't be explained by mainstream science. Dr. Warren explained that the underground structures discovered by various researchers weren't human constructions or natural cave formations, but were actually components of what appeared to be a vast technological system that extended throughout the mountain range and possibly beyond. The system seemed to be designed for purposes that human science couldn't comprehend, but its operations had measurable effects on local geology, weather patterns, and biological systems that suggested it was actively managing environmental conditions across large geographical areas. Mark's journey into the Devil's Backbone region in October 2023 was intended to be a carefully planned investigative expedition. But the area itself seemed to resist conventional navigation and documentation methods. GPS systems malfunctioned, compass readings were unreliable, and electronic equipment experienced failures that suggested interference from powerful electromagnetic sources. The forest in the region showed signs of manipulation that weren't apparent from satellite imagery, with vegetation arranged in patterns that seemed designed to channel movement along specific routes while discouraging exploration of other areas. The first direct evidence of the technological system Dr. Warren had described came when Mark discovered installations hidden throughout the forest that combined natural cave formations with constructions that appeared to be both ancient and impossibly advanced. The installations were connected by tunnels that had been carved through solid rock with precision that exceeded anything achievable with conventional engineering methods, and they contained equipment that seemed to monitor and control environmental conditions across the entire mountain range. As Mark explored deeper into the underground complex, he encountered the remnants of previous investigative expeditions, including equipment and personal belongings that belonged to Jessica Chen and other researchers who had disappeared in the region over the years. But he also found evidence that some of the missing investigators hadn't just vanished. They had been integrated into whatever system operated beneath Devil's Backbone, serving functions that required human intelligence and creativity, but were directed toward purposes that transcended individual human understanding. The central chamber of the underground complex contained what appeared to be a control center for the vast technological system, operated by individuals who had once been human, but had been changed in ways that allowed them to interface directly with technologies that existed beyond conventional scientific understanding. Mark recognized several of the operators as people who had been reported missing over the years, including government scientists and military personnel who had apparently chosen to abandon their previous lives in favor of participating in activities that served purposes far greater than anything they could have accomplished in mainstream society. The revelation of the true scope of the Devil's Backbone phenomenon came when Mark was shown displays that revealed the system's global reach and its role in managing environmental and geological processes that were essential for maintaining conditions suitable for human civilization. The technology wasn't alien or supernatural, but represented an advanced form of human development that had been evolving in hidden locations for centuries, developing capabilities that mainstream science was still thousands of years from achieving. The individuals who operated the Devil's Backbone system explained that they served as guardians for humanity, using technologies that had been developed through collaboration between surface humans and intelligences that existed in deep underground ecosystems throughout the world. Their work involved managing natural disasters, regulating climate patterns, and preventing geological events that could threaten human civilization. But their activities required absolute secrecy to avoid interference from governments and corporations that would attempt to exploit the technologies for short-term economic and political gains. Mark was offered the opportunity to join the system as a communication specialist, using his journalism background to help coordinate information sharing between the various hidden installations that existed throughout the Appalachian mountain range and beyond. The work would involve abandoning his previous life and accepting genetic modifications that would allow him to interface with technologies that required enhanced human capabilities. But it would also provide him with access to knowledge and experiences that no mainstream journalist could ever hope to achieve. The choice Mark faced was the same one that had been offered to every researcher and investigator who had discovered the truth about Devil's Backbone. Join the system and help protect humanity from threats that mainstream civilization wasn't equipped to understand, or be relocated to a secure facility where he would be cared for but prevented from sharing knowledge that could destabilize the delicate balance that maintained global stability. The system required the participation of individuals with specific skills and knowledge, but it also required absolute commitment to purposes that transcended personal ambitions and individual desires. Mark Caldwell chose to join the Devil's Backbone system, abandoning his career as an investigative journalist to become part of an organization that protected humanity from dangers that most people would never know existed. His final article, published posthumously through automated systems, described his research into the disappearances in Appalachia as having reached a dead end due to lack of evidence, and recommended that authorities focus their resources on more conventional explanations for the missing persons cases. The Devil's Backbone region continues to operate as it has for centuries, managing environmental and geological processes that maintain conditions suitable for human civilization while remaining hidden from mainstream awareness. The system continues to recruit individuals with the skills and knowledge necessary for its operations, offering them the opportunity to serve purposes that transcend individual human understanding, in exchange for abandoning the lives they knew, in favor of work that will never be acknowledged or appreciated by the world they help to protect. The mountains keep their secrets, and humanity remains unaware of the guardians who work in darkness to ensure that the light of civilization continues to shine in a universe full of threats that could extinguish it in an instant.